Can you believe it? It's been 50 years since UCLA Asian American Studies was established.
Oh, yes, I can kind of believe it.
We want to talk today about your participation and your time at the UCLA and afterwards. But before we do that, let's start with your beginnings. How did your family come to the United States, and what was it like growing up for you?
Okay. My dad came to the U.S. When he was a teen, very young teenager. He came as a paper son. That's why later on he changed the name back to Wong, but he wasn't Wong at first. And he went to school in the U.S. and during World War II he served in the U.S. Army. Afterwards, he went back and and married my mother in Tualla village in China. And in 1947, 48, they came over, and I was born in 48. They had some intention of going back to the East Coast, but I never knew the complete details, but someone sold them a laundry. So then they stayed out here in California. And so I grew up. My dad's was actually fairly acculturated. He's a smart guy and he picked up his language really well. From in that standpoint, my mother had a hard time her whole life. So that's how my parents came, and that's where I was born.
Where was this in California?
Uh, I was I was born in Yuba City, California, but I never lived there. Just that's where the hospital was. I grew up in Marysville, California, just about 50 miles north of Sacramento.
Now, that was Chinatown in the earlier days, but by the time you were there still a lot of Chinese Americans around?
There was a small group or a small segment of the population, but not very large. The town is one of those small Sacramento Valley towns, 10,000 people, farming community. In a 2-block area, there were 3 Chinese laundries. Yeah.
What was the town farming?
Peaches, tomatoes, walnuts.
What was it like going to school as a young Chinese boy?
Um, some of my best friends in my life are still some of the people I went to school with, and even aside from high school reunions, I make a point to see them. Uh, so I've maintained contact, and but I was always pretty aware that I was one of a few Chinese people, and I never grew up angry or anything, but I always knew that there were some things that were not always quite right. But I can always think back and put it into context because I had a lot of good friends there. And so to turn that trite phrase around, I can say some of my best friends are white people.
What were some of the unusual circumstances that made you realize that you are Chinese?
There are no unusual circumstances. You know, if you're an immigrant, I think it's not just for Chinese, but for everyone. If you're an immigrant child and you come home and you know your parents either don't speak English or they speak very little, you know you're not the same, you're different. And so that was just always part of my upbringing. I never quite said it this way, but I guess you made me think now. One of the things I liked about Marysville was I liked school. I liked school because my parents really pushed it. It was that almost illogical reverence for school, to accept everything that school has to offer. But I didn't mind, because that's where I made a lot of my friends, and I got to do things that it got me out of the protective boundaries of my household. Right. That was part of the upbringing. Yeah.
Did you work at the laundry?
Yeah. After a while, I started. We had a hand laundry, so it's funny. I hardly ever iron. You know, if I go to a banquet, I ask, is it okay if I wear this white shirt? It's all wrinkled. I mean, it's going to be mostly covered. I don't even want to iron anymore. But there was a time when I did that. You know, I would iron clothes and do stuff like that. Yeah.
That was your primary job as a young boy?
Yeah, until I got older. Then I went out and did some other things. So I always tried to make some money. Probably when I was 17, I did the hardest job that I ever had in my life. I went and picked peaches for about a month. Right? So I used to go out, and my dad would drop me off at the orchard, and then I would pick fruit until it got too hot. And I was the only non-Hispanic that was out there. But I learned a lot through it. Picking fruit is probably the hardest job that I've ever seen in my life. I didn't mind, because, you know, I'm 11th. I'm an 11th grader. I'm getting ready to go in my senior year, so whatever I can get, I'm happy with it. But I saw people that was their life. Yeah. So I got an appreciation for things. That, and we lived in laundry, so I got to see my parents work. You know, and that has pros and cons. I saw when I grew up, it was all the negative, because there's all this tension and it's uncomfortable. And we all sleep in one room. There's 5 of us, I had 2 sisters, and none of that's a lot of fun. Right? But you understand what life is about better when you get older. It's just that when you're 16, you don't want to understand life. You just want life to be easier.
Around when you were in high school, things were starting to happen in the United States, in the American South, even in California. Were you aware of some of the...
I wasn't aware till later. It happened when... that's why when I teach high school, I always tried not to be down on students who seemingly didn't know what's going on in the world and didn't seem to care, because I think too many adults forget that we were a lot like that. I grew up right in the heart of the civil rights movement, and I just didn't pay any attention. The example I always like to give is 1968. I was in college then, but it was the March on Washington, and I didn't even know there was a March on Washington. I didn't even know that Martin Luther King gave a speech. I just wanted to find out if the Giants won that day, because I was a baseball fan. And then later on, I now think that's the greatest speech in the history of the United States. But I lived through it. It just didn't, you know, you just, some people understand those things when they happen, because they're more politically aware, the way they're raised, they're just more sensitive, they look out. And for me, it wasn't that way, but it affects you. It was very interesting times. The civil rights movement was a very significant period. Yeah.
Were you aware of the music and the changes that was happening in fashion and art?
No, I just liked the music that I liked. It was just like that, you know. I liked Motown. I liked the Temptations, but I didn't. But it wasn't until later, because by then I was graduating from college, and then I saw even the Temptations were singing some songs that were different, you know. But when I was in high school, I wasn't. I find actually it's interesting. Like I've never had an affinity for rap music. I'm sorry to offend a lot of people I really respect when I say that, but at the same time, I think that the rap music has played a role in bringing awareness to people that I don't think music did for me. You know? Yeah.
You were ambitious, though. You decided to go to university at Davis.
Yeah, it was just sort of, that's what you do, you know. That's a good thing about the traditional first-generation Chinese families. They know that if you might not be like totally famous or something, but if you want to be at least sort of uncomfortable, be at least comfortable, and to be not poor, you know, you should go to college. And then I was really pushed to be a professional. So when I went to UC Davis and I started to study engineering, they were very happy with that. And they weren't too happy that I found it so hard that I wanted to switch, but I'm sure glad I switched.
What did you switch to?
I switched to history. Became a history major and math minor.
I'm sure Davis was quite a culture shock.
A little bit, but partly I insulated myself a bit because there were a number of my good friends from high school also went to Davis. So we'd hang around with each other a little bit in the dorms. And then the second year when I moved out, we roomed together. So it wasn't quite like sometimes people go, you know, they go to high school and with their best friends, they see them like 40 times during the day, and then they don't see them and they feel bad. It wasn't quite like that. But it was both. College is interesting that way. See, I think at some point it's almost like when you come out of high school, you should get alienated a little bit, because you shouldn't go through life and you just have your same friends all the time. And so when you get out of that, it's not comfortable, you know. But then what you do is, you know, unless you get totally depressed or something, you make friends and then you get happier with yourself. And so I went through that like everybody else. And so I like college for that. It broadened my outlook. I'm glad I went to a 4-year school. I feel bad for kids now because it's so expensive, you know, but at the time I went, it wasn't quite that bad. And so to be able to go to a 4-year school instead of community college, that got me to meet more people. So that's why I was at Davis the first year they ever offered an Asian American Studies class.
So in 1969, you took the first Asian American Studies class. Did somebody encourage you to do that, or you just fell into it?
No, it wasn't even like for a good reason. It was like, I remember talking with one of my friends, and because they advertised it. This is going to be the first Asian American Studies class, and I remember talking to one of my friends saying, "We should sign up and go. This could be really weird in an interesting way, you know." Instead of going to a class where you look around, there's 250 people there, and there's like 5 Asians, right? You walk in, there are 45 people there, and they're all Asians, right? And wow. Yeah. But I had, but like I was talking to you before, I had a really good guy, Isao Fujimoto, who taught the class, and he's one of these guys, he could talk and be interesting for a long time, right? And so and it broadened my thinking, and that class probably more than most other classes when I was at Davis broadened my thinking intellectually. Yeah.
Can you give an example of that? Do you remember some of the readings?
Well, just to study things like relocation and such, which that would be new. As in at Marysville High School, I don't think that I ever in 11th grade U.S. history studied relocation experience. So that was interesting. It's not any one example, but to go to class and you could study history, because I was a history major, so to study the history and to see that that your own ethnic group was part of that in much more of a way than you ever thought. It doesn't hit you right away, but over time it kind of sinks in, and I like that. And I like that because after a while people talk, and they converse, and so you didn't have this situation where you have a class where there's like 5 Asians and they never talk, right? So there are little things like that. There was no one thing that stands out, right? But Isao always would raise interesting questions, I don't know why this one stuck out since you asked me. One time he just asked the class, he said, "You ever wonder why all the people who pick up the garbage in Davis, California, are all African American?" And that, then he pointed out, in the other jobs, there are no African Americans. But if you go and you follow the garbage truck, you see all the African Americans. Like it was nice to have someone raise questions like that.
Do you know who he is? Where did his background?
He was in a department called Applied Behavioral Science, and it was like sociology. I think he never finished his PhD. Like, he was just more interested in doing things. I don't know if he did. I don't know if he's still alive.
Is he a Nisei or?
I thought he was a Nisei, yeah. Yeah.
In your other American history courses, had you ever heard about the concentration camps?
I probably did, but not in any way that stuck out. Because if it's in a book that's 600 pages long and it has one paragraph, and then your teacher is lecturing on a whole bunch of other things, unless you go out and you make that your term paper project, you're not going to do that. It wasn't until later that I would, when you do term papers, that I would select Asian American history topics. Yeah. I never had a chance to talk to many people. I didn't even know that many of the people that were in that first class, but I just have to think that for us, that there are people who had the same experience I did, who found it to be different and to be interesting. Yeah.
So you had this catalytic class, sticks out in your mind.
Yeah. For me, the way that links up is nothing ever happens in a vacuum. So the other thing that helped a lot was that the other person that politicized me a lot was my tennis coach at UC Davis. He was a really good guy. He was the Peace Corps director in Malawi and had come back to Davis and decided to pick up coaching again. So I played tennis in high school and I thought, nah, this is it. You go to college, you can't play. But I just missed playing. So I went out in my sophomore year and I played my sophomore, junior, and senior years. And around the time that the Asian American Studies class was when my tennis coach said to us on the teams that I'm going to an anti-war march in Sacramento. Davis is about 20 miles from Sacramento. And anybody want to go? you know. So I was starting to get more aware then. So I went with him, and he did a lot to politicize me. And so I think those things kind of came together. And then there's the whole larger issues. I don't think anything ever happens in a vacuum. I don't think, I think if I was born 20 years earlier, I would have been a very different person. I could physically, and even the background with my parents, been about the same, but I don't think it would have been the same. It was, the world was going through a lot of turmoil with the Vietnam War, and it took me a while to realize that it wasn't just the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. It was the whole end of imperialist colonialism that just rippled out and just affected everybody in the world. And so this comes together. It's not. My tennis coach was affected by that too. So then he worked with us, and he was a good guy, and I respected him. So and the next thing that happened was, is it okay if I just go on like that? Because I figure if you ask me, these are the things that probably are, if you want to know how I progressed so that I end up at UCLA Asian American Studies. That's part of the story. Everyone's getting drafted. Cambodia happens, in invasion of Cambodia in 1970. 1970 is the first year of the draft lottery, where they decided they're just going to pull names out. And then all the number ones get called for the draft, the number twos. One of my friends got number one. He found out on CBS National News that he was going to be drafted. I pulled 74, so I knew I was going to be drafted. And so then you have to decide what to do. And I never wanted to have to think about what I had to do, because I just wanted to just live and just kind of be stupid, right? That's why I envy young people, by the way. I say this half jokingly to my high school students. Man, I wish I could be like you guys again, you know, be young and be stupid, you know. I'm older and I can't afford to be stupid. But what I meant is that's nice, you know, you're young, you're growing up, you're making friends, and you don't look for trouble, but it's there. There's this big war going on. So then I had to make a decision. And I ended up, and some of my friends in the tennis team, and I would talk all the time. And that's the kind of stuff that went on in that period. It was just like students, friends, teachers, they talk to each other. And then, so I decided eventually, took a while, but I decided that I would resist the draft and apply for a deferment. They call it a conscientious objector deferment. And that just extended out for a long time. I didn't really feel I had much hope for that, but I did. And so later on, I actually ended up refusing induction but by then I was at UCLA. I was in grad school. So all that came together. That's the context of taking Asian American Studies. And then I guess it was unusual. I must have found out, some people found out that I was resisting the draft because I decided to write a letter to the student newspaper. It was the Cal Aggie newspaper. And they took the letter and they made it into an article. They wrote something about how the U.S. was wrong in its foreign policy and wanted to save face or something. I tried to use that catchphrase. And so I think people knew, and so I was just taken aback. They wanted me to come to a small group, Asian American students, and speak speak to the students. So I said, sure, I'll do that. And they invited Floyd Hewen from UC Berkeley to come in. And so he's kind of a famous dude in Asian American movement and all that. And I thought that was pretty funny that I was speaking with him, because, you know, I never even thought I would do anything like that. And then they found out
Still at Davis. Right?
that was still at Davis. And they found out it was because I was there. They're trying to develop the stuff that was being developed in Asian American studies was so basic, right? That people must look back on it and just say, wow, you actually did stuff like this. Like there's no collection of materials for Asian American studies, you know, other than like Betty Sung's book and a few things like that. There's nothing out there. So they actually asked me one time, if we gave you a little money and hired you part-time, why don't you put in 15, 20 hours a week, go to the library and just look up articles and journals, and then do a little summary so we can do an annotated bibliography. So I remember doing that for them, and it was just done in that way. They printed it out on a typewriter, and no computers, and they printed it on a typewriter and took it to a print shop, printed it and stapled it together, and then it was an annotated bibliography. So I guess because things like that happened, they asked me to do that, probably because that's what I always thought. They just thought it was kind of odd and interesting that here was an Asian American student that was going to fight against the draft.
There were also very few Asian Americans in history.
Well, that's probably true too. Yeah.
So you decided to go to UCLA for grad school.
Yeah. I just applied to different schools. I applied Davis, didn't get in, but I realized later that I applied for the PhD program, and I wasn't going to qualify for their PhD program, but UCLA had something that said Masters en route to PhD. So since they had that box, I checked it. So that allowed me to get in, and I got graduate school EOP, and I just decided I wanted to continue to go on to grad school while I fought the draft.
So you weren't thinking way ahead, like, what am I going to do with a history major?
No. I was thinking ahead more than I realized at the time, because I was going back to my friends and my former teachers and asked them if I could sit in on their classes sometime. I just thought it was, and maybe it was just because I wanted to have something to do, but it did have that effect eventually. That when you watch people that you know do something and they're your friends or they're your former teachers, then that got me to kind of like that. And so later on, that got me to thinking about doing it. I became a TA at UCLA, Asian American Studies.
So you went straight to the core of the Asian American Studies movement when you came down to LA?
No, actually not. I just went to grad school, and I don't know if I even visited Asian American Studies Center at Campbell Hall. And I think the people at Davis contacted someone at UCLA and said that I had done some work with them on an annotated bibliography, and that perhaps if they wanted some people to do some work along that way, or that they might contact me. I think that's how it happened. I feel really bad that I forget the guy's name too. I think it was George Kagiwara. If I spelled that wrong, you can look it up. But he was new to UC Davis Asian American Studies when I left, and he finished his career developing Asian American Studies at Davis. He was a good guy. And so I got contacted by some people at UCLA Asian American Studies to meet with people. That's how I met Eddie Wong. I met Eddie Wong and Amy Tachiki, only she was Amy Uematsu then, and they were working on Roots. And
so they had already started.
They had already started. Basically, the idea they wanted to have the different segments of it, and they asked me if I'd be interested in working on it and selecting articles and putting it together. I did very little work with it. Amy did a lot. Anyone that interviewed her, she would just laugh about it, but she's lying. She did a lot. It was like I had instant admiration for her. That's never changed to this day. And I think Franklin Odo worked on it too, but him a little less. Yeah, Franklin's a good guy, and he's a very friendly guy, but I think historically he always spread himself too thin.
So you got right
so Franklin, if you read this, take it in a good way. So
you got right into the middle of roots. I mean, that's
yeah, it was almost the end of it. That's why I always think when people say, "Oh, you worked on roots," I said, "Well, I just kind of tagged along." Yeah.
Is roots important?
Roots is a funny book. I think that in a lot of ways it was. It served to be a textbook for the early years of Asian American Studies. But even while it was serving that function, I thought it was a reflection on how Asian American Studies was developing, because there was such an preoccupation, necessarily so, I think, with the whole identity of being Asian American. So that if you're doing the book like that, all of us are thinking about it. We're thinking about it was almost like you couldn't. I don't think you could do stuff in those days and be detached from it. You're always thinking like, I'm doing this and I'm Asian American, right? So so it had that effect. It's pretty raw. It's a pretty raw book, and in some ways, I think if people want to understand Asian American Studies, I'm gonna the development of it. I'm going to take a guess that just thumbing through Roots itself is probably a good way to get a sense of that. Yeah. But that's why a lot of new courses happen at the university level anyway. Like I'm sure it happened with women's studies and African American studies. Right? There's no textbook, and you can't wait for it because by the time UC Press gets around to it, you know, your class would have been denied, you know. So people just put together articles and they try to get copyright when they can. If they didn't get it, sometimes they just did it anyway and they take it to a printer and basically just almost like staple it together. And, so I got to work on that, and I always think that it was really a privilege to work on it. And then after that, they asked, the other thing about Asian American Studies at that time, there was this really heavy emphasis on making the university relevant to the community. Like doing work in the community was very important I think in all movements at that time. And so the Asian American Studies Center allocated some money to hire people to be part-time research assistants to do work in particular communities, and basically there was a lot of latitude to do different things.
So you were a research assistant with
Yeah.
the Asian American Studies,
Yeah.
and you started to get to know other people.
Yeah. And then Franklin had an introductory class, and then so Amy and Eddie and I were his TAs. And so that was my first experience teaching at any level, I guess. Yeah. So that was real nice that they asked me to do those things. I don't think I was ever ready for any of that. You know, seriously, I wasn't ready to do research to do annotated bibliography. I wasn't ready to pull together a section for a book that's going to be used in a college class. I didn't have the knowledge of how to do that well. I didn't have the knowledge of how to run a section in a college class. I didn't have any of that, but that's the thing about Asian American Studies. If you want to break new ground, there wouldn't be the need for it if those things had all been done before. But since they weren't, then you just had to have people willing to do it. Yeah. That's why Yuji said to me one time, "Look at all these incompetents that are doing this stuff." But that's Yuji. Yuji is so cool. I could accept that from Yuji, because he was a top academician and did all this this research, and never cared about getting his PhD. He just wanted to do good research, and did a lot at Berkeley for the Asian American movement. Right? But he's a very blunt guy, so he just said it that way. But in fact, it's true. He just said, but it can't be helped. That was the way Asian American Studies was. I didn't know that much about how to do research in the Chinese community, you know. But it seemed like a good idea. So I think another woman named Peggy Lee was one of the research assistants. So we tried to do this, like, study of sewing factories in Chinatown. And we just bumbled around and we just put together this article. It was really not a very good article, but we just do what we can do, you know. And then out of that, I did interviews with people who own Chinese laundries. And so out of that, I think I wrote an article for Emory Journal. Yeah. I never finished my PhD, but if I did, I would have really, I think I could have got pretty excited about doing a dissertation and eventually make a book on the history of Chinese laundries. It would have been a fun personal experience, and hopefully it would have been okay. Right? But I never finished my PhD. I got my master's and took a leave and never came back. But that's why I'm kind of, that's why on camera now and off camera, I've mentioned different people I think should be interviewed, because I feel like I was able to participate in Asian American Studies after it was founded in those early years at UCLA. People had already set it up. There was a lot of struggle and turmoil that went on before I even got there. And then soon after that, because I left grad school and didn't pursue Asian American Studies academically, then I just kind of left, and I would remember doing things like reading Emory Journal later, or seeing it and say, wow, this is really developed. Right? So
who would you credit for most of the visionary work in those days?
I always got the sense that Alan Nishio did a lot as one of the first directors. Don Nakanishi did a lot. The people who took on those jobs, they were pretty committed, you know, like I say, it was too bad that, it's really very sad that and such a nice guy like Alan Moriyama got cancer, and he just couldn't overcome it. But he was so serious when he took on the curriculum coordinator position. Then there's the Uematsu family, you know. Mary's still doing a lot of stuff with it. and Mary's mother, Elsie, dedicated her career. She retired from, and even though she had two daughters that were so involved in it, it wasn't always easy for her because there was this generational gap. And sometimes I think she felt like, well, at the time, I didn't understand why she felt so strongly that people didn't understand her. Then I got older and I understood. But there are people like that. There's a certain continuity. I like Ronnie Rano. I'm thinking of the people who were directors. I like Ryan Rano because he's real serious and. But he wasn't as left liberal as some of the other directors. So he was just more like he tried to do things on campus. But I liked him. Yeah. I think that the early people were very good. That's why I mentioned that you got to talk to Lowell because he came out here and he's very instrumental in doing things. And then there's other people that I don't even know. There's so much work that's been done. I can't even keep track of it now. It's like
you started teaching on different campuses.
Yeah, I applied to teach where I could, and I was teaching Asian American Studies at Cal State LA for a while. And the same thing there too, I think the first time or two I taught a class, I thought I knew what I was doing, and then I taught a couple more and realized I had a lot to learn. But after I teach 30 years of high school, I finished my 30th year and I'm thinking, I got a lot to learn. So teaching is a invigorating job because it's that way you do the best you can, and if you do a good job, there's always a better job you could do. Yeah. But it was, I had no background in it, and so, but I really liked it, And I did that for maybe 2 or 3 years. I never taught at one school for any long time. The only way would have been for me to go back and finish my graduate degree. And after a while, I decided I didn't want to do that and went out and worked in a factory for 4 or 5 years.
What were you doing?
I worked in like light manufacturing, a plant that's closed now in Burbank. At a certain time, it had like about 1,300 people working there. It was like just a big zoo, and everyone would park their cars and go into work. And I was very energetic and at the same time very naive and very left politically. So I tried to push a lot of stuff and lived through some interesting times. Yeah. I just wouldn't do that anymore. Like hand out leaflets and then go into work afterwards. But I learned a lot there. I'm glad I did all those things. You grow up in a Chinese laundry and your parents work hard their whole life, and then you go to school and you meet different people, but then I spent those years working in a factory, and my line was all women, mostly Cuban women, so I learned a lot about what they went through. And
how did you feel when the Vietnam War was over?
Well, I kind of felt it vindicated what I did on a personal level, but I felt that way even before it was over, because it was over. It didn't take till, then 74, 75, when the helicopters got out and people were hanging on the tracks of the helicopter. It was over, and it's it's still contentious as to whether it was a good thing or not. But for me, being a draft resistor, I felt it vindicated what I did. I felt I did the right thing. Well, I never went to jail because unlike other people who resisted earlier, by the time I resisted, the war was ending. So I went and resisted, which when you do that, when you don't cross the line, you commit the crime. And then I went home, waited for a federal indictment. But they didn't want to mess around with stuff like that anymore. So they threw my case back to the draft board. And while I went through all the process again, the war ended. So I never had to think about, should I go to jail or should I go to Canada? Which...
Well, you thought about it, you just didn't have to do it.
I knew I would have to think about it, you know, and either one could have been the right thing to do. You know. Now that I go visit and take vacations in Canada, it could be a lot worse places to live for the rest of your life than Canada. You know, it's not a bad place.
How did your family feel about all your political activism?
Oh, they were really distraught at first, and but they ended up being supportive. Most parents are of things that you do. Yeah, I learned through my experience that that's true, and then when I talk to friends and other people, most parents are pretty supportive of their kids. Yeah, but I learned a lot from working in the factory. I actually ran for shop steward and got elected, which I always thought was funny because I asked one woman to nominate me, and they're also scared of being identified with me. There was a woman that she liked me, so she nominated me, but she signed her name on the nominating sheet, so no one could even tell that was her signature. Then I got elected, and I did my best to fight for the workers. And,
so no regrets. You're proud of that part of your life.
Yeah, you know, so. Yeah, I don't have any regrets about those major things I do. I don't know why I get bothered by little things like I wish I didn't talk to that person the way I did 35 years ago. That kind of stuff bothers me. I got a list with 1,000 items like that. But should I have resisted the draft or not? Should I have left grad school? Should I have gone work in a factory? Those things, no regrets.
In 1982, you became a pioneer at Lincoln High.
A pioneer? That's an odd.
You started.
Yeah.
A new trend there.
Yeah, well, what I did was, after I worked in the factory a few years, I went out to New York, and people asked me, would you like to go to New York and work on a civil rights case that's trying to raise money for the case of the Greensboro 5? It was anti-Klan demonstrators who were killed by the Klan on November 3rd. 1979, and would you be interested in going out there and doing some work for that to raise money for the civil rights suit and do publicity and get paid zero? But I was still pretty young then, so I said sure. I went out there, and Phyllis and I both went out. She's smarter than me. She took a year leave of absence from Castellar. After a year, she was like, because she grew up in Philadelphia, so it wasn't even political. She just said, I hate the East Coast. I can't live here. I'm going home. And then I stayed a little longer, and I came back, and I had nothing to do, and I wasn't sure what to do. I'd done fundraising, but no one's going to hire you because you're not in that fundraising circle. And Phyllis said, why don't you apply for a job at LAUSD? They take anybody. They need math teachers. They'll take anybody. Which was in fact true. take anybody. Yeah, and it happened. I'm a math minor, you know. But, so I started at Lincoln in the second semester of 1982, and I thought I was bad when I first started teaching college. I didn't realize bad was. I mean, I just thought, God, everything I did was wrong. Yeah. I have this semi-serious comment I always make that I might have left teaching if I was actually a little bit better. But I was so awful that I couldn't live with myself if I quit then. So I thought, I got to work at this for a little bit longer and get a little bit better. But then, you know, high school kids are very endearing. You know, you work with kids that are very close to that. They're very endearing. The younger kids, the younger students are, they're not afraid to put you at a distance. So, so after a while, it just grew on me. And
what is Lincoln High? Can you describe it a little bit?
Lincoln High's in Lincoln Heights, just north of downtown. It's Hispanic, Asian community, approximately maybe like about 80% Hispanic and 12–15% Asian and a smattering of others. Mostly immigrant, working class community. So I started teaching math and then I switched over to social studies.
You taught Asian studies and cultural awareness.
Yes, I wanted to teach the class because they had Mexican American studies, but the administration wasn't real enthusiastic about it. Because people are always asking for certain classes to be taught, you know, and the administrators only want a certain number, right? And they just weren't that open to it, so it just took a little while. Finally, I wrote a grant, got a set of books, and so that if they didn't let me teach a class, I would have had a set of books that went into a warehouse. So I got to teach the class, and that was a whole interesting experience. Because I brought into it those ideals about when I taught Asian American Studies at a college level. And you could be, like everybody's more political at that time. And what happens with elective classes in high school is that they're quite often classes where they need to find room for somebody who doesn't have a class, or they just moved into the school in the middle of a semester, or they just got out of jail. So it wasn't a class like you necessarily had the highest academic students. And I didn't have the best attitude about that at first. It took me a while to realize that, you know, all teachers say, I want to teach all the kids, you know. Doesn't matter, I'm there for everybody, you know. And then when you don't get the best kids, then you feel bad, and then you realize, hey, maybe I need to reorient myself. So I had to do that a little bit and do things like teach basic skills in Asian American Studies. Yeah, but I got to really like the class, and I actually got to appreciate that I had an opportunity to teach Asian American Studies to a class that was 85% Hispanic. And I got to thinking, like, this is a good thing. You know, not a bad thing, it's a good thing. And then some of the, you know, because some of the Asian students I knew, because I was the Asian club sponsor, they would tell me later that when they went to college, they took Asian American Studies. But they didn't have room for it when they were at Lincoln. They had too many AP classes they had to take. Yeah. So that was, I always think fondly to that I did that class. I was glad that I got to be Asian Club sponsor. That's one of the first things I had to give up when I found I was getting older and more tired. Right? But I really felt bad about that. Because we always did things like the Chinese New Year's assembly, and so after school for like a month and a half, I would just be in auditorium because they had to have an adult there. You know, I didn't know anything about it. The kids would do the dances, and they asked me, "How does this look?" I said, "Oh, it looks good." I didn't know.
Why is Asian American Studies important?
Well, especially in the time that I became an Asian American Studies student, the thing of identity was very important. It should not be minimized that not only when you take a class, but when you teach a class, that you're learning about yourself. That was important, and there's a certain time of history. I'm not sure I'm right about this. I'm just going to take a guess that's part of teaching Asian American Studies in the early 1970s that was not in the 1980s or the 1990s, you know. And but it was when programs were just starting. When you had things like the Third Wharf Strike in San Francisco State and stuff like that. So the classes took on a whole another dimension. So I think they're important in that way. Excuse me. And I think they're still important because for education to be more inclusive, I've discovered that it's not something that happens really fast, and it can go forward and then go backwards a bit. And so that's why I thought it'd be nice if I wore this t-shirt for the interview, because this is a coalition that's been pushing forward on the state level. And it's a real struggle for the people doing this. A bill to have ethnic studies as a graduation requirement in secondary schools has gotten out of committee, is going to, I believe, the state Senate floor. I don't know if it's the Assembly or the state Senate floor, but it's still a struggle. It's taken all of that work. And so the idea of education being more inclusive is just an ongoing issue. And I don't think that detracts from the idea that a textbook should have more about Asian American studies or ethnic studies. I think a regular sociology class and a U.S. history class should have it. But that doesn't, I don't think that should be counterposed with having classes that are on women's studies and on Mexican American studies and Asian studies. I don't think the two should ever be counterposed that way. So that's a fight that's going on, and so it's important at different times in different ways, and for different people, I guess. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, what would you wish for ethnic studies now, in the sense that what other directions, what other agendas should they advocate for?
I don't think I can answer that question well, because I don't think I know enough about what's going on. I was mentioning that in the conversation before we started talking, that my niece teaches at Cal State Fullerton, and it's kind of cool because she gets the reporters will recently called her and asked her opinion about crazy rich Asians, and she got her name. Her name's Christine Chen, teaches at Cal State Fullerton, and she got her quote in the newspaper article. So I just know there's a lot of stuff going on, but I don't think I know all of it. So I don't think that I'm in the position to be saying what directions I think it should be heading. And I wouldn't make any judgments as to did it or did it not realize the promise and the goals that people thought of 30 years ago. I would just say that when I see a lot of things happening like this, when I see the media changing, and I think that this is all part of it. I think that the changes that went on in Asian American Studies affected people in a lot of different ways, so that it ripples out, and then people do a lot of good things, right? And it doesn't happen fast, you know. Yeah, but I don't think I know enough. That's why I wouldn't make any judgment. I don't think that would be fair.
Talk about playing basketball with UG. What kind of a basketball player was he?
Oh, it's interesting you asked that question. I really like you asked that question. I like people who are intense about what they do, and he played at Berkeley High School. He was like 6 feet 1 inch tall, and I think he was a center then, I think. But UG's even older than me, right? So back in those days, you could be 6'1" and be the center. But he had a passion for basketball, and I think it's no surprise to me because he had a passion for everything that he did. He did really great research. I think people that have delve into the subject, like Asian American labor in the development of Asian American history, would give a person like him credit where he never went out to get that credit because he didn't care about getting his PhD. He didn't care about titles. What he cared about was he went to Japan and lived there so he could learn how to read and write Japanese, so he could get primary source material, and he could read it, and then he could write an article that would really tell people what the Japanese Issei immigrants who were developing farmer thought. I liked it. He sometimes is very blunt, you know, but I never took anything badly from him. What is he, besides telling me that I was one of these people that really was not really equipped to teach. I think one time he disagreed with me on the position I took with some people, and he just looked at me and said, you know, you're being played for a fool. You know, you're really stupid, you know. So, but, you know, I don't know why, but, you know, I think if you're a person like that, you do such many good things, and people take that from you. They took that from Yuji because they knew that he wasn't out. That's just why he was very blunt. Yeah. I love playing basketball with him. Well, one time these guys at UCLA beat us in one game, and they laughed at us after they beat us, and I knew they were going to lose in the second game because Yuji was so pissed.